Hello, my name is Niall McKay and welcome to Living with PSC, a podcast about the rare disease of primary sclerosing cholangitis. Now, PSC causes the bile ducts inside and outside the liver to become scarred, narrowed and eventually blocked, and leads to liver cirrhosis. In this podcast, we aim to dispel some of the myths about the disease. Well, welcome, Professor Cyriel Ponsioen. Very good to speak to you again. I was wondering if you'd like to just tell us, I know that you work out of the Netherlands.
Yeah, I work in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, where I lead a research group on PSC, and also some research lines on inflammatory bowel disease, which, as many of PSC patients and their caregivers know, is closely related to PSC. And with regard to the inflammatory bowel disease, I'm mainly looking into the role of the microbiota. So we perform a fecal microbiota transplantation in these patients, and to look at what happens in the microbiota that does the trick. But on PC, I have a research line already since almost 20 years, in which we study the epidemiology of the disease, so the natural behavior, and also study the gut-liver axis, so the link between the gut and the liver in this disease.
I see. Yeah, I think the last time we talked about fecal microbial transplant, and it was one of those things. It was only 2 years ago, but at the time, it was not quite accepted in the same way that in the connection in the way that is accepted today. It seems that there's been lots of progress made with the sort of microbiome and the disease prognosis, hasn't there?
Well, with regard to disease prognosis, I'm not sure whether we have made a lot of progress. We have made a lot of progress in the sense that it becomes more and more easy to study the microbes in the bowel more in detail. A few years ago, we could only study microbiota in terms of species, and now we are able to study them at strain level, and even at what they produce, which eventually in the end is what's the most important thing. So it's not the bacteria themselves, but it's what their output is, the toxic substances they produce, that is probably has something to do with liver disease or bowel disease. So that's the progress, but for most indications, other than some forms of therapy refractory infection of the bowel, the treatment is still experimental. And in PSC, there's only very, very limited data on the effect of transplantation, and we're looking for funding to start a major trial in PSC connected with inflammatory bowel disease to see what the effect of fecal microbiota transplantation is in this disease.
And if I understand it correctly, and please feel free to correct me, but what's happening is that there are certain microbes that are being identified, and that these microbes excrete or produce a certain material, and that material leaches in through the mucosa or the cell wall or the stomach wall into the cells and possibly into the liver. Is that how it works?
That's how it works, and we used to think that we should look for the bad bugs, but nowadays we're more inclined to think that we should look for the good bugs, so that it is a number of good bugs with which we live in homeostasis, with which we live in sync for the past let's say few million years. That is what you need to restore disharmonization, which may lead to chronic inflammation. And if you have enough of these good bugs, which excrete certain substances, which indeed make the barrier between the environment, or actually it's the environment with all the bugs in your bowel and the mucosa and the blood system behind that, and keep that in good shape and in good order so that the bad bugs, which everybody has in his bowel, cannot penetrate the wall and may give and do harm in both in the mucosa but also in the liver when they're transported through the blood to the liver. So if we are able to identify which good bugs you need that are lacking in patients with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease that also have PSC, then we're, I think, on a good track.
And do we know what these bugs, what the good bugs are?
We are beginning to elucidate that. There's certain substances which are called short-chain fatty acids.
Yeah.
Which are being produced in large quantities by several groups of bugs, which you need in order to have a proper bowel lining, and which you need to have proper energy source for your large bowel cells. So it's the fuel, the gasoline on which they live and on which they thrive. And if you have enough of them, that seems to downgrade inflammation. And we know for a good part which bugs, and there are hundreds of different bugs in your bowel, and maybe 30% of them are able to produce these short-chain fatty acids from fermentable fibers mainly. And there's a few ones that are now within our vision that we think we should focus on and see if we can promote outgrowth of these bugs in patients who lack sufficient numbers of these bugs.
And the $1 million question is, I suppose, how do you promote the growth of these? Is it through certain types of food, or is it down to that yet, or do we know?
It's indeed $1 million question, and probably it's a bit of this and a bit of that, which, as often in life, it's not just one factor that is causing a certain effect. It's a complex of different factors that is probably necessary in order to get the good bugs at the right place and able to outgrowth. And because of that, we are not currently pursuing giving one or two apparently or potentially healthy bugs in a capsule to patients and see if it works. No, we give fecal transplantation, which is many bugs, many different bugs, but also many substrates from which they eat, and probably a lot of other factors that enable these bugs to outgrowth in an environment that is favorable for them to outgrow indeed. And there have been some small studies, not in PSC but in other diseases, where they tried to give taking the short route one or two potentially putatively good bugs to see if that helps, and so far these are quite disappointing, and probably that is because you don't need just the bugs, you need a whole ecology, a whole environment in order to get these bugs in the right place and let them grow out in sufficient numbers so that they produce these favorable substances that are healthy for the bowel lining.
And I think I asked you this before, but is there factors that can promote that, like through diet or through a vegan diet or the ingestion of lots of cabbage and green vegetables, or any of, is there a diet that helps in this, or fermented foods, for example, like kimchi or these sort of things?
Yeah, well, this is a question that is often asked by patients. There's no outpatient clinic without this question, and of course, it's also very important because patients want to add to the therapy and want to be self-sufficient in promoting health. So that's a very understandable question. But again, it's difficult to answer. It seems that substances that contain a lot of fibers are healthy, because these bugs that produce these short chain fatty acids, they need these fibers in order to change them into short chain fatty acids. But which ones are really beneficial has not been sorted out in ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, and not at all in PSC. I know a number of patients with relatively modest ulcerative colitis who are able to control their disease activity only with a vegan diet, which by nature contains a lot of fibers, of course. So that is probably a factor that is of importance. We know that people in country where the diet is mostly vegan or vegetarian have less inflammatory bowel disease, and people who migrate from countries where they have mostly vegan and vegetarian diets to countries where there is a Western style diet, they more often get inflammatory bowel disease than their family who still lives in Burkina Faso or India, for that matter. So from observational data, it seems that a vegetarian or vegan diet is better for your colitis or your Crohn's disease, and may also be better for your PSC, because we're talking about PSC, and there's a few observations that the more active your inflammatory bowel disease is, the more active your PSC is.
And can things like, acids like acid reflux or these sort of things, do they affect it as well, affect the balance of the stomach?
Well, not the acid or the acid reflux, but what does affect your microbiota is the medication people take for complaints of acid reflux or dyspepsia. The proton pump inhibitors have a significant effect on the signature of your microbiota. Whether that is beneficial or detrimental, we don't know, but at least what we do know is that it has a profound effect on your microbiota composition.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. I talked to Dr. Korsnick recently from the Brigham Young Women's Hospital, and they seem to be doing a lot of research along this area as well. Are you guys in touch? Do you keep in touch as to what's going on around the world with these things?
Well, not literally with Dr. Korsnick, but I know his work, of course. And what we're trying to do with international consortia, also with American colleagues, is that we want to promote the regulation of how we perform fecal microbiota transplantation in a safe and regulated fashion, because 2 years ago there were two calamities with fecal transplantation, not for PSC, not for ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, but for other indications, which were for FDA a reason to make the regulation on fecal microbiota transplantation much more strict, which also had some bearings on what we did, because it had to do with multi-drug resistant bacteria, so-called E. coli bacteria. These were transplantations which were done by centers which were not recognized as official centers. So we were not informed about how well and how safely they performed the transplantation. But anyway, these two patients were transplanted with fecal transplantation from a donor who had this multi-drug resistant E. coli, and one of the patients died. So there was a calamity and a disaster, and then FDA did its usual reflex by making it much more difficult for donors to donate, which also had bearing on our donors. Actually, we think that was a little bit overacting because, for instance, in the United States, you have an organization which is called Open Biome. They did more than 45,000 transplantations, and there was no report of such a disaster so far reported. So actually, fecal transplantation is very safe, but it sort of triggered a reaction of all kinds of regulatory bodies, both in the United States and in Europe, that a fecal transplantation should be very, very restricted. There is also some lobbying taking place from industry who wants what they really want is a ban on fecal transplantation, so they can put in their synthetic consortia of microbiota, which means a pill with only 4 or 5 or maybe 2 bugs instead of a whole community given by fecal transplantation. And because fecal transplantation for some diseases is so very effective, it's very difficult for industry to do their trials. So they actually want a ban on this, and in order to counter these kinds of movements and activities, we have a few international collaborations with colleagues all over the world who are interested in fecal transplantation and try to regulate it in a sensible, safe, and high quality fashion.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. It's often the way, isn't it, that there's a reaction to something, but also that there's some industry pressure, and of course, it's not. It's an easy thing for them to attack in a way, given its nature, I suppose. I just want to get to the International PSC Study Group in a sec. What about the effect of antibiotics? Because most PSC patients, their only treatment, if you like, while they're getting cholangitis attacks, is antibiotics. So what about the use and the long-term use of antibiotics for PSC patients?
Well, I have 2 answers on that. It's again a question that's asked regularly. I have a more general answer to that, and the general answer is that antibiotic resistance, as I just mentioned with this multi-drug resistance E. coli bacterium, antibiotic resistance is one of the most big threats to global healthcare, which means that we should be very cautious and restrictive with antibiotics in a general sense, which means that long-term antibiotics for chronic diseases should actually be a no-brainer. You shouldn't do that unless it's completely unavoidable and you know that it has a good effect. And with that, having said that, we don't know whether it has a good effect. I mean, the oldest studies in PSC were actually done in the 50s of the past centuries in Australia, where they thought that PSC was caused primarily by a transfer of bacteria from the bowel through the blood to the liver, and they treated that with doxycycline, one of the oldest antibiotics, which is still often used for, let's say, pneumonia and pharyngitis. There was some effect, but not very much. But so the oldest treatment for PSC is actually antibiotics, and there is some interest in antibiotics with regard to an antibiotic which is called vancomycin that has been advocated by some pediatric centers where they treated for a long time, 3 months or even longer, pediatric patients with PSC with vancomycin, and they see some effect on, for instance, some laboratory parameters, liver function that improve, and that has given some interest in this treatment. But if you study these data very carefully, there's actually very, very little positive effect, and way too little, at least in my view, to outweigh this general principle that we should be as restrictive with antibiotics as you can. Vancomycin actually is a so-called reserve antibiotic for treatment of certain multi-drug resistant infections caused by bacteria that do not respond anymore to common antibiotics. So it's an antibiotic that actually is one should be even more restrictive than in general. So I don't believe in this, and I'm not a very big proponent of antibiotic treatment for a longer time to improve the outcome of PSC. Having said that, indeed, there are situations in which a patient who has a bacterial cholangitis should receive antibiotics and should receive good, proper treatment for, let's say, 1 or 2 weeks with antibiotics, which can be very successful.
And what about the long-term use, like the indefinite use of antibiotics to control the cholangitis?
Yeah, there's a few situations where you need to do that in patients who have a disturbed or biliary tract, which is not amenable to endoscopic therapy anymore to dilate strictures, who are not candidates for liver transplantation, and who keep on having bacterial cholangitis. And indeed, in these patients, you may have to give endlessly antibiotics, with the risk that bacteria become resistant for that antibiotic, and then you have to change to another antibiotics. We don't have that many different brands to give in oral formulation, so that may be a little bit tricky, but every now and then you have a patient that you need to treat with long-term antibiotics, and it can be successful. I currently have 2 patients which I have to treat endlessly with antibiotics, because when I stop within 1 or 2 months, they come again with the cholangitis, which is not amenable to endoscopic treatment.
Yeah.
So it happens, but only rarely, and one should be very reserved with that.
And what about bacteriophages?
Yeah, well, phage therapy is becoming increasingly en vogue, or a hype.
Yeah.
It is actually quite old. The oldest study I know in phages was done in Georgia in 1923.
Oh, wow.
What phages actually do, there's a lot of phages in your bowel. Actually, the number of phages is about as big as the number of bacteria you have in your bowel, which is about 1 trillion. And phages feed on certain bacteria, and some phages can also kill bacteria. So phages can influence the composition of your bacterial flora, and in that sense, they may be interesting in trying to shift or modify the microbiota profile you have in your bowel into a more healthy profile. First, of course, we have to know which is then this healthy profile. So phage therapy is interesting, and I think we will hear about that much more in the future. Especially because you can also transplant phages.
So moving on to the International PSC Study Group, can you tell me what is it and how does it work?
The International PSC Study Group was founded in 2010 by a group of visionary PSC experts from Europe, from Norway and Germany actually, with the idea that if we ever were to advance the field and to improve the care for PSC patients, we should collaborate. Because it's a rare disease, everybody is struggling with actually rather low numbers of patients to do your studies with. If I look back to my PhD, my thesis, which I did in the late 90s. If you look into my booklet, you can see that it is a constant struggle of getting enough patients in order to do proper and sound statistics in order to find out whether the observations we did were really true observations or it was just a chance finding. And everybody is struggling with that. So in 2010, this group was erected in Oslo, and currently it is a group of more than 170 PSC experts, clinicians, and basic researchers of more than 26 countries all over the world. I happen to be the co-secretary of this study group currently. The secretariat is in Amsterdam. And I do this together with my colleague Ulrich Boyers, and it is a society which is non-commercial, it's unpaid, and its main purpose is to promote collaborative research and collaborative improvement of the quality of care for patients over the world.
And how have you found it working? Have there been outcomes from it that you are particularly happy with?
Yes, they have. I think in the collaborative research, we had at least 20 papers since 2010 in high-impact journals that came from this group through the collaboration and through the fostering of the IPC study group in order to promote this collaboration. The largest one was a study in which many of the retrospective databases that exist throughout the world and were by themselves too small to give sufficient numbers for proper readouts were combined. This was done a few years ago, and the paper on this huge effort appeared in Gastroenterology, the number one scientific medical journal in the field, in 2017, and contained more than 7,100 PSC patients coming from, I think, at least 30 centers or so. It was a huge effort. It was a huge struggle to get all those data aligned, to get them through the quality control, missing values, discrepancies, because everybody described and had defined their values in all their respective databases in a different way. So this was a really a big hassle, but eventually coming up with more than 7,000 patients to describe the cause of the disease was a very big achievement. Another achievement was that we were able to do some genomic studies. Genomic studies means that we look at the DNA of PSC patients to see if it differs from healthy controls and to see if it differs from other diseases with which there's some relationship, like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And this was an effort a few years ago, which contains, by heart, I say 3,500 patients, and also came up with a few leads that were interesting in the sense that it predisposes individuals to get PSC. Not in the sense that it is a purely genetic disease. The entirety of genetic abnormalities we found in these cohorts can only explain at most 20 to 25% of the disease, but at least there were some clues. And these kinds of studies can only be done if you have thousands and thousands of patients. So for that, we needed the IPC study group. What we also did was, I was the principal investigator of this study, was that we wanted to look in patients who had a so-called dominant stricture, so an important stricture in their draining bile ducts. If you are better off to treat it with a stent, so a small tube, which you place through the stricture and then take out after 1 or 2 weeks, or with a balloon dilatation, meaning that you put in a deflated balloon, which you can put through the working channel of your endoscope, then inflate it to 6 or 8 millimeters for 1 or 2 minutes, then deflate again and get out. Which of these two treatments would be better in terms of alleviation of complaints and improvement of the lab tests, but also how long it would last. So we did the study in 9 centers throughout Europe, under the realm and the auspices of the International PSC Study Group. And this was also published in Gastroenterology in 2017. So these are only a few examples of many studies we have been doing, and we're still doing a lot of research in a collaborative way, trying to avoid competition and those kinds of elements that may pose a problem and a hurdle to collaborative research, because all of these 170 or more researchers, we all know and realize that only through collaboration in a collegiate atmosphere we can improve care for this disease.
So what you've done is come up with a sort of a single way of defining people in a database so that the international study can our researchers can mine that information. Is that correct? Or?
No, that's not correct, but that would be the ideal way. What I described to you in the Gastro paper of 2017 was that all the different databases that existed, or many different databases exist, were put together, and we're trying to merge to see if we could come up with a sort of common denominator for certain aspects of the disease. That was 2017. What we now are aiming, and that's my strong view, is that we should work towards promoting prospective database. And prospective means that you follow the patients into the future with patient-reported outcome measures, meaning that the patients themselves log into databases and file information, file data upon questionnaires, because I strongly believe that the patient is the best data source. Especially when it comes to data that are in some parts subjective, such as health-related quality of life data, data on complaints, data on important life events, such as, for instance, a bowel resection or a liver surgery or whatever. Patients can perfectly describe that, and you can check with the treating physician then afterwards what happened exactly. So I think patient-reported outcome measures in a prospective fashion is extremely important and should be the future. And next to that, we should get rid of that immense quality problem of merging different databases with different data definition, as we had in the past, and which led to so much problems and so much effort, and probably even to wrong conclusions, because the data were not uniform. And within this IPC study group, because we have the IPC study group, we were able to decide, I think it was 4 years ago in Washington, when we organized a meeting in which we decided upon a so-called data definition set, and also a minimum data set that everyone who wants to collect in his or her database in a prospective way, so into the future, data of his or her patients, he should do it in a certain fashion.
Well, listen, thank you very much for your time. It's been great talking to you and so informative as always. And we look forward to keeping in touch and finding out how things are going in the future.
Anytime.
Okay. Thanks. Take care.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this week. For more information about PSC and for a list of people and topics we'll be covering in the near future, please go to www.pscpartners.org. That's www.pscpartners.org. PSC Partners is a non-profit organisation dedicated to providing education and support to primary sclerosing cholangitis patients. There is information and resources on the website. There is a conference once a year. There is a private Facebook group that you can also join. Also, please join our patient registry. This is an anonymous database that provides research support to the medical community who are researching this disease. Thank you very much for listening.